Are students going to join us? I hope.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope it's not just a recording.
No, it's live. It's live. They're there on Zoom.
So how have you been otherwise, Karthik?
Yeah, doing fine, sir.
I can see Madhvi also here.
Yeah.
Good morning, sir.
Morning. I actually have had a bad night last. Yes. Firefighting somebody. Yeah. But
I
I
hope
thought
I'm doing fine now.
not really. But
Oh.
I didn't want to cancel it again. Or rather, I didn't want to cancel it and put you again through the bother of rescheduling.
Yeah. Madhu, we can start now.
Yeah. A very good morning to all the dear students. I welcome you all in online lecture series for M.A. English Semester 4, jointly organized by Departments of English of Rajkumar Kibal Ramani Kanya Mahavidyalaya Nagpur, Government Institute of Arts and Humanities Nagpur, Mahila Mahavidyalaya Nagpur, and J.M. Patel College Bhandara. Today we have among us an erudite scholar, Dr. Prantik Banerjee. In fact, Banerjee sir needs no introduction, but we feel that the young generation should know the achievements of such a great person in the field of education, and that's why I would like to introduce sir to this series. Dr. Prantik Banerjee is an associate professor of English and former IQAC coordinator in Hislop College, Nagpur. He is a member of Board of Studies, RTM Nagpur University, Nagpur. He is an external expert of the Board of Studies, VG Vaze Autonomous College, Mumbai, and the M.A. English Academic Advisory Committee of Christ University, Bengaluru. He has been a keynote speaker and resource person at several international and national conferences. He has delivered endowment lectures in the University of Rochester, USA, Loyola College, Chennai, Jyoti Nivas College, Bengaluru, and Lawyer Bhutan University. He is a PhD supervisor for RTMNU and an examiner for Bharati Southern University and Bishop Herbert Autonomous College, Tamil Nadu. He was invited as an expert on the drafting committee of NCCI National Higher Education Policy. He is a NAC expert and RUSA trainer and has conducted many training programs for colleges and universities in India. He is an external advisor to IQAC of reputed colleges and universities and empaneled as National Faculty Trainer for AIACHE, New Delhi. He was invited as an expert on the selection committees for appointment of lecturers by St. Stephen College, New Delhi. He is a certified HRD trainer from TCS Bengaluru and has conducted several teacher and corporate training programs. His publication include 3 books, 9 book chapters, and 41 research papers in peer-reviewed journals. His recent books are Cultural Studies, Text and Context, and Theory in Praxis in Literature and Culture. His writings have been published in several anthologies, including Globalization Reader, Nomadism Reader, Asian Literature in English, Films and Literature, Conflict Studies and Race, Caste and Gender. He is on the editorial board of several international and national journals on higher education as well as English studies. I welcome you, sir, on behalf of all the organizers and the host institution and the students. Thank you so much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. When Karthik asked me to forward my biodata, I didn't actually expect Madhavi to be reading up the whole thing. I thought you would abbreviate it. But thanks, Madhavi, for going through the rather ponderous list of whatever you said, right? Thanks for being such a gracious introducer. Well, I see that there are 25 students, 25 participants, right? And once again, I suppose this is part of this is, I think, the third or the fourth series where the four collaborating colleges have been doing this wonderful work since, was it last year or this year?
This year, this year.
This year, right. And I think what it does is whenever some action is taken in a concerted and cooperative way, it always bears fruits and results. To my student friends, so first of all, kudos to the principals as well as the chief organizers, the entire organizing team of this online MA classes that have covered not only, I think, the first year, but now the second year as well as the semesters. To my student friends who are here with me, before I, take you through my session, I suppose since the fourth semester exams are around the corner, I think they begin on the 19th. You have your paper starting from the 19th of this month. Today is the 15th. Now, therefore, I'm making two assumptions here. One is that this particular session is more like a revision session for you. It's more like a recap for you, because I'm sure that teachers, your own teachers in your respective colleges, would have covered the syllabus and would have taken you in a far more detailed way. They would have covered all the units and all the topics. So when the invitation came from Dr. Kapil Singhal and Dr. Kartik Panikar, I readily accepted, only because I felt that, with exams just around the corner, I thought it would be a good exercise to give you some pluses, which means some add-ons, something that perhaps you would have already done, but then some pluses, as I said, some additional inputs, some additional insights maybe. The second thing is that, the paper on literary criticism, literary theory and criticism, the one that I'm going to be doing UNIT-4 with you, it's sort of, it's a paper which is pretty, which springboards, which leaps through nearly 60 years, 60 to 70 years, right from the 1920s to the 2000s, to the aughties, and therefore to squeeze in all the background topics, the striking or the key ideas that have changed the terrain of literary theory and culture studies in the last 60, 70 years. It's a very challenging paper. It makes huge demands from the teachers as well as from you students. And so I think I will begin my session with, stating the fact that if you look at the syllabus, especially the UNIT-4 component, broadly, there are two area studies within that UNIT-4. There are two area studies. One falls into the domain of literary studies or critical theory, and within critical theory, this module of UNIT-4 actually covers one particular theory, one particular critical area, critical study, and that is postcolonial theory. And the other is what you could call the other topics that are given in the same unit, studies. So, in fact, there are two broad domains in UNIT-4. One belongs to the domain of literary theory or critical theory, which is essentially about postcolonial theory, and the other topics such as John Fiskey's television culture, or culture and culture studies and consumption. All of these come within the category of culture studies. Unit. The paper is challenging, the unit is challenging, the modules are challenging. So let me quickly. Kartik, I think you'll have to mute yourself. So in the meanwhile, I'll share my screen. Do confirm with me whether my screen is visible.
Yes, sir.
Oh.
Yeah, please proceed, sir.
So like I said, if you look at your for Unit 4 topics. Then in background topics, you have Homi Bhabha, Franz Fanon, and subaltern studies. Notice that I've put them in a single line, primarily because these three would actually fall into the category of post-colonial studies, and then consumerism and culture studies falls under the domain of culture studies. And then the texts that are there for detailed study, the first one, Edward Said's Crisis in Orientalism, which in fact is a part of an excerpt from his groundbreaking book called Orientalism, belongs again to the broader area studies called post-colonial studies. And then John Fiske's television culture falls in the category of culture studies. So I think it's important to make this distinction because although when we talk about post-colonial studies and culture studies, they do have certain overlapping ideas, overlapping terrain, but the methodology or the approach that we employ in reading and interpreting and analyzing key thinkers, their key ideas, and the text that is mentioned for detailed study will be slightly different. Let's take, I think although post-colonial theory or post-colonial literature is offered as a elective paper in our own university syllabus for MA, I don't think all colleges offer this. So when you're doing literary criticism in this paper, the minute we talk about Homi Bhabha, Spivak, and subaltern studies, and Franz Fanon, well, we need to have some background on what post-colonial theory is all about. Broadly, I mean, it's an extremely broad, wide, and all-encompassing, terrain. When we talk about post-colonial theory as one of the definitions, there can be many ways to define and describe post-colonial theory. But the one that is on your slide, that post-colonial theory is a method of interpreting, reading, and critiquing the cultural practices of colonialism, where it proposes that the exercise of colonial power is also the exercise of racially determined powers of representation. Now, even in this working definition, this is a working definition, and it does not cover all the aspects of post-colonial theory, but it does point out, it does foreground some important aspects of post-colonial theory. One is that it's a method, which means it's a method of inquiry. It's a method of rereading and reinterpreting not just literature, but any meaning-producing text. I'm sure since you have done Derrida and you have done Roland Barthes in your previous sessions, in literary theory and culture studies, what we call a text is not just a book. A text need not be a tangible, concrete, physically embodied thing. It need not be a book, as I said. A text can be a film, a text can be a cartoon, a text can be your traffic signal, a text can be your lifestyle choices, I mean, the food that you eat, the dress that you wear. Even what you and I are doing today is not just covering the syllabus or teaching and learning, but what we are doing, the virtual platform over which we are connected, is again a text, although it's a virtual text. Now, text is not physical. It need not always be visible. It can be intangible. It can be abstract. And so when we talk about text in literary theory and culture studies, we are talking about any meaning-generating system of science. Any system of science which produces meaning, which produces symbols, which produces certain signification is called a text. So culture itself is a text. And by culture, I mean, here, of course, within post-colonial theory, this definition is talking about the cultural practices of a particular phenomena that took place in world history, that took place in the history of the world for as many as 200, 250 years. We are talking about the history of colonialism. So it is historically located. Post-colonial theory is historically located. Why? Because its ideas, its practices, its methodologies are all situated within a terrain that is defined by the specific history of by the specific history and culture of peoples, let's say in Asia, Africa, and much of South America or Latin America. The second important definition here is it's the cultural practices. As I said, cultural practices is any text that brings out meaning. And then the definition also highlights a third important point, and that is racially determined powers of representation. Friends, when we do Homi Bhabha, when we do Franz Fanon or subaltern studies, it's not just about texts and finding, it's not about examining texts in order to uncover, in order to decipher their meanings, but it is also to look at the manner in which these texts are embedded. These texts are, they are layered with the relationship between power, politics, and identity. The history of post-colonial theory. I'm talking about, the intellectual history of post-colonial theory is also the political history of colonialism and imperialism. I won't go into the detail of it, but the minute we say colonialism and imperialism, these are two words that you need to know, and I think you may have been given some background. When we talk about colonialism and imperialism, it has had a long history. The world history has been, a continuous. It is a trajectory. It is a trajectory of how Western powers have, over a period of nearly 300 years, dominated non-Western locations, or non-Western countries and non-Western places and their peoples. So it's post-colonial theory, therefore, is historically located because it examines the mechanism, the entire imperial machinery, the machinery by which imperial powers, such as Great Britain, France, Germany, and later on the United States of America, have over a period right from the beginning of the 16th century till today, yeah, imperialism is not dead. So the history of post-colonial theory, or the intellectual history of post-colonial theory, is located in the historical terrain of imperialism and colonialism, which began from all the way from the 16th century up to our modern times, or shall we say our postmodern times. The minute we say it is a history of power, it's a history of identity, it is a history of politics, then it is also a history of racism. It is a history of the colonial. It is a history of exploitation and discrimination on the basis of the color of the skin, on the basis of class, on the basis of gender, where European powers for nearly 200 years have systematically, structurally, politically, economically, and militarily have subjugated native populations in Asia, Africa, and South America. So, when we do therefore literary theory, we are no longer doing. We are no longer reading a text in order to understand its characterization, its themes, its techniques. Well, when we do post-colonial theory, when we adopt post-colonial approach to the interpretation of literature, yes, these things also do matter. But more importantly, post-colonial theory is a methodological approach to uncover the larger issues of power, politics, racial discrimination, economic exploitation, and psychological subjugation of native people by European powers. The minute we talk about post-colonial theory, the figures that you see on your screen are some of the major critics, they are the major exponents whose ideas have contributed to the making of what is called as post-colonial theory. These four people, Homi Bhabha, Franz Fanon, Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, um, it is their ideas, it is their writings and their ideas which have shaped the contours of post-colonial theory. And both Franz Fanon, Homi Bhabha, and Spivak, in fact, all four are prescribed in your as background, both as background study. Said's text, Crisis in Orientalism, is prescribed in your Unit 4 for detailed study. And I will be giving you a little insight into their key ideas, the key ideas of these key thinkers as we go along. Please
रहने दे, हाथ गंदा कर ली मैंने, बोली देखो चेंज होगा तो ये कर।
Students are requested to mute. Please mute. You're disturbing the session. So when we are thinking of post-colonial theorists, these thinkers such as Fanon, Said, Homi Bhabha, and Spivak, we think of within post-colonial theory, we think of their key texts, their key works, their key writings. Edward Said's Orientalism, these two works, Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism, although they are separated by a number of years, are considered to be, as I said, path-breaking works. These two works have defined the shape, the trajectory. They have mapped the trajectory of post-colonial theory. Spivak, among her many writings, this particular book is a standout book, in other words, Essays in Cultural Politics. And we will be discussing one particular essay, an essay that has had a wide-ranging and singular influence upon the relationship between feminism, with native women, and racism and patriarchy, and that is Can the Subaltern Speak? Homi Bhabha, yes, another very, very important contributor, key theorist to in post-colonial studies, and that is the location of culture. Although, I mean, these are just representative. These are selections of their works. Their writings have been, all three of them have been very prolific and prolific writers. Said is no more with us, but Spivak and Bhabha continue to have a huge influence on on area studies in the academia, particularly post-colonial studies. Again, I'm not going to go into the detailed historical background, but suffice it is to say that, as students, before you approach Bhabha and Spivak and even Fanon or Said, you need to familiarize yourself with the terms that are there on your slide, namely colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, decolonization, and post-colonialism. So when you're thinking of colonialism, as I said, colonialism was essentially means the military conquest of by the Western powers over non-Western locations, and primarily, I mean, if you look at the history of colonialism, we go back to 16th and 17th century. Look at the figure of Columbus, for example. Of course, this is a rather it's a rather parodic depiction. It's a very ironical description of how Western explorers and Western sea voyagers have actually, in the name of expanding the frontiers of their own kingdoms, have actually subjugated, have annexed other people's lands and other people's resources. So when it says, let's celebrate Columbus Day by planting flags everywhere and saying we own it, well, this is the way in which European powers, including the United States and Great Britain, have actually perpetuated rule and conquest over other people and other lands for centuries. Imperialism is perhaps a little more tricky word, While colonialism, as I said, is the political, military, and economic exploitation of other people, imperialism is more like an ideology. You see, when we talk about ideology, ideology refers to a system of belief, ideas, a system of beliefs, ideas, and attitudes that legitimize or justify a particular project. So imperialism is a thought, imperialism is a belief, whereas colonialism is a practice. Uh, Imperialism, while colonialism, you see, although the history of colonialism is, as I said, spread over 200 years, where all these European powers have, for decades, for years, they have conquered and exploited uh, uh, places in Asia, Africa, and South America. By the 1940s, 50s, and 60s of the last century, colonialism was gradually coming to an end. Many countries in Asia, for example, India and Pakistan, or in Africa, such as Nigeria, or in South America, all of these countries which were erstwhile under the rule of their colonial masters were gaining, or were, yes, they were gaining their independence, their political freedom from the erstwhile masters after a long period of uh, uh, of of anti-colonial struggle. In India, for example, we talk about the freedom movement. Yeah. But imperialism, even though India, for example, countries like India and Pakistan, Bangladesh are now independent countries, sovereign republics, sovereign countries, yet imperialism continues to work. It continues to operate because much of what we think, much of our lifestyles and the things that we believe, the things that we wear, the things that we eat, all of these seem to have a predominant influence. It still continues to have a predominant influence by, let's say, by Western modes of thinking, by Western styles of culture and Western styles of consumption. I'm giving you just an example. I mean, the food that we eat or the dress that you wear, whether you're wearing the Nike shoes or the Reebok shoes, or you are having a McDonald's pizza or a burger. Look at the way in which what we are doing even today, our lifestyles, our consumer choices are predominantly influenced by things that define Western culture. Now, this is just a very simple example, but then imperialism means the continuing political and economic exploitation in a different form, in a different guise. That is called neo-colonialism. For example, multinational companies and the way they continue to, come to underdeveloped countries or third world countries and exploit their lands and exploit their resources is an example of what is called neo-colonialism. Neo-colonialism, colonialism in a new form. Decolonization, countries as I said, winning a hard-fought independence is actually just, these denote the process of decolonization. And post-coloniality is our contemporary reality. Well, key terms: Eurocentrism, racism, colonial discourse, mimicry, ambivalence and hybridity, counter-narrative, counter-canonical, subaltern. I mean, once again, so when you're looking at your exams, if you want to understand what you're writing, what you may have read and what you may have studied and what you're going to write, these are again key concepts that define the works of Homi Bhabha, the works of Frantz Fanon, Homi Bhabha, and Spivak. And I will be touching on a few of them as we go along. When we talk about post-colonial theory, I mean, Frantz Fanon, you could say, is one of the early. Yeah, he would probably demonstrate the first wave of post-colonialism. Frantz Fanon. Who was Frantz Fanon? Well, he was an Algerian born in the island of Martinique, and he studied medicine in France. In other words, he's a black man. He's a black man who studied born in Martinique. Martinique, remember, Martinique was a French colony like I said, many of these European powers had colonies spread across the world, right? And Martinique is a small island in the Caribbean, and it was for many years, in fact, till the 1960s, it was under French rule. And so Franz Fanon was born not in a free country, was born in a country, or rather, born in an island which was being ruled by the French. Uh, but and Fanon studied medicine. He went on to do his PhD in psychiatry and became a practicing doctor in Algeria. Algeria, Algeria, as some of you would know, again, Algeria was was a colony of France. France occupied Algeria in the beginning of the 19th century and went on to rule Algeria for nearly 100 years. It was only in the 1960s that 1940s or 60s, I don't exactly remember, but yeah, 1961, the year 1962, the year Frantz Fanon died, a year after Frantz Fanon died, that Algeria became independent. Uh, you see, when we talk about Frantz Fanon, he is a precursor to post-colonial theory because many of his ideas, although he was, like I said, he was a doctor, but more than a doctor, he was a freedom fighter. He was the voice of Algeria. He was the voice of the oppressed and the marginalized. And in his writings, we find the polemics of politics, which means that much like what Gandhi did for India, uh, uh, what Gandhi did for India, in a similar way, Frantz Fanon did for Algeria, winning, continuing to struggle and lead the people, the oppressed people of his country, to free themselves from the yoke of French occupation. He's an influential figure in post-colonial theory, and there are two books which are there on your slide. One is called Black Skin and White Mask. This came out in 1952. This came out in 1952, and the other is The Wretched of the Earth, which came out in 1963. In fact, Wretched of the Earth was a posthumous publication. It came out after a couple of years after Fanon died. Why is Fanon such an important thinker in post-colonial theory? Is because he is one of the first. He was one of the first who was fascinated, who was interested in examining the psychological effects of colonialism on both the colonizer and the colonized. I mean, it was Fanon who argued that that colonialism. Remember, I told you that Algeria and Martinique were under French imperial rule, under French control, and Fanon found, as he was growing up, as he was a student and then became a medicine man, a doctor, he found that the native populations of both Martinique as well as in Algeria suffered or continued to show the psychological ill effects of a prolonged foreign occupation. Fanon, being a psychiatrist, was interested more in the psychological effects of colonialism upon the minds of the native population rather than the political, military, and economic control of France over Algeria. The first thing that when we talk about Fanon, his key concerns in a writing spanning nearly 30-40 years. Remember, I told you he was a freedom fighter. He was a freedom fighter, and he led the War of Independence, Algeria's War of Independence against France, writing not only writing these books such as Black Skin and White Mask and The Wretched of the Earth, but he also was writing political essays, political tracts. He represented the unliberated Algeria in the United Nations, and he basically was trying to rally and mobilize support from people across the African continent in support of the Black natives or the Arab natives of Algeria. his key concerns, what we find in Fanon's writings are, that he examines the political, the political, social, and cultural conditions of colonial oppression. But more importantly, he was interested in examining the psychology of the colonized and the colonized, which simply means, friends, that when the colonizer comes in contact with the colonized, what is the thing that happens? How does it impact? How does the rule of the master, affect the minds or the psyche of the native population, that is those who are colonized? He was, in many of his other writings, like a dying colonialism, he also examined the processes of anti-colonial struggle. The anti-colonial struggle, for example, Algeria's war of independence against the French Empire. And then in his writings, although he did not live long enough to see his own country free, that is Algeria, free, but he was also occupied. He was very much concerned about the state of not only a colonial or a colonized Algeria, but also to what would happen to his country after it attained independence. You see, Fanon was absolutely sure and confident that somewhere, down the line, that Algerians would win their struggle. They would win their independence from France. And so he was also worried about what would be the nature of this newly independent Algeria whenever it happened. So the inherent dynamics and tensions of cultural nationalism. To give you just one idea, Fanon talked about in his writings, particularly this book, Black Skin and White Mask. This was based on his own experiences as a medical practitioner, as a psychiatrist, treating Arab and Black people, in whom he found an extraordinary and alarming number of people suffering from neurosis, psychosis. That means mental disability, mental conditions. And so when he treated these patients for the mental illness, what he discovered was that these were the damaging effects, not of poverty, not of illiteracy, not of unemployment, not even about their domestic conditions, but these were the ill effects of an extremely repressive French rule. For example, blacks, including blacks were easy targets. They were always targeted, and they became victims of police atrocity. They could be put behind bars without any reason. And in a very interesting chapter from Black Skin and White Mask called "The Fact of Blackness," Fanon exposed the hypocrisy of the French government. The French government, which internationally sort of represented the French Empire, not just France, but the French Empire as one that gave equal freedom and equal opportunities to even to the Black population, which included Black Christians and Black Arabs. He exposed the hypocrisy or the falsity of these claims that were being made by the French government. And in an example from his own personal life, he gives an incident as an example of racism, when he talks about how one day, walking on the streets of Paris, or Lyon rather, he was puzzled to see a white woman with a child walking towards him, and how the child clutched his mother's arms, and screamed out in horror, saying, the Negro, that he's going to eat me. Now, even in this little incident that he personally witnessed on the Parisian streets, it was clear to him that even a young child, barely 6 or 7 years old, was conditioned by had already internalized the structures of racial feeling and racial attitude. that the child who was only 6 years, 7 years old was merely reflecting what the adults, what his own parents may have told him, that, blacks are primitive, blacks are savages, blacks are cannibals, don't go near blacks. And therefore, on seeing Fanon, seeing a black man approaching him from the street, from the opposite end of the road, here is a child who hollered out, saying that the black man is going to, eat me. This personal incident, alerted Fanon to the damaging long-term psychological impact that colonialism and imperialism have on native populations. That the native was considered, the black man was always considered by the colonial master, by the imperial ruler, as somebody, not as somebody who was savage, pagan, evil, and the violence. Fanon was examining the violence of this set of attitudes and behavior that the white man showed towards the white ruler, or the white master showed towards the black natives. So the consequences, black skin and white mask sort of explains the consequences of identity formation. The fact, as I said, that it leads the exploitation and oppression of colonialism leads led Algerians, the black population, to be traumatized. And as I said, Fanon was more concerned in examining the trauma, that is the psychological effects of colonialism upon native population. So like Fanon writes in Black Skin and White Mask,
those who have any difficulty,
that a man was expected to behave like a man, I was expected to behave like a black man. As if because of the color of his skin, he was not even considered to be a human being. He was considered first to be a black man and not necessarily a man. So this imaginative distinction between man and black man, man would denote a category which was exclusively white. The white man, the white French, the white American, the white Englishman. This identity was therefore colonization constructed an identity based on difference, where the white man was man. The self was that of the white man, civilized, rational, scientific, progressive, and modern. On the other hand, the black man, that is the other, was constructed as the other. That who is not white is the other. And the otherness of the black man was constructed in a way that always made him occupy an inferior position, which means it always gave an inferiority complex. The black Algerian always felt that he belonged to a culture, that he spoke a language, and that his own identity was something that was always inferior to the black man's culture, the black man's language, the white man's culture, the white man's language, and the white man's identity. Notice, therefore, that what Fanon is saying is that colonialism and imperialism brought about a sort of a differential treatment, or a differential set of structures and feelings, a set of structures and feelings and practices that differentiated the white man from the black man, where the white man, in this binary, the white man was always superior and the black man was always inferior. The white man was always modern, the black man was always primitive. All right. The Wretched of the Earth, again, to quickly give you some of the points that he deals with in The Wretched of the Earth. Remember, it was a book that came out in 1963, 2 years after he passed away. And it is again a book that defines many of the key concepts and ideas that constitute post-colonial theory. Here, he's unlike the first book, Black Skin and White Mask, where he was looking at colonization, the process of colonization from the point of view of psychology. Here, he was more interested in two things. One is nationalism. nationalism and national culture. You know, he talks about uh, uh, he was interested more to know to predict rather to predict or predict and prophesize about the kind of country that Algeria would become once it would be free from the French rule, the French imperial rule. And one of the things that actually worried Fanon was that post-colonial meaning after such countries became independent of their colonial masters, they would be called post-colonial countries. So in post-colonial countries, Fanon was very clear about one thing, and he wanted to alert people. He wanted to alert the government, the governments of post-colonial countries. He wanted to alert the intellectuals, the leaders, the political thinkers, and the statesmen of these liberated countries, newly liberated countries, about the pitfalls of nationalism. The pitfalls not of nationalism, well, nationalism that is extreme, nationalism that is hyper, nationalism that begins to foster a sort of a nationalism that makes that, you know, he was cautioning his own countrymen not to fall into the trap of having a nationalism which made them believe that once they are free, that they are superior to everybody else, and therefore generate the same kind of hatred and the same kind of hatred and prejudice against people of other people that did not belong to their own tribes, people that did not belong to their own race or ethnicity. That is called xenophobia. I mean, he was in this book, The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon was warning against hyper nationalism or ultra nationalism. He believed that that national culture. He believed that if Africa and Algeria after independence were to truly become a self-respecting sovereign countries rather, they need to rebuild their national culture. Fanon believed that national culture plays a very important role in building the nation state. And so national culture, he advocated that if Africans and Algerians wanted to construct a national culture, they needed to return to their national myths, for example, African culture after a free Africa needed to go back to African myths, go back to their cultural practices. So why? Because he believed that it is within the discovery or rediscovery of the mythic, cultural, or even mystic traditions of Africa that one could that black identity or the identity of Afrikaners or Africans, the black identity of Africans could be sort of resurrected, could be recovered. So a national culture, according to him, is framed in three stages. He in The Wretched of the Earth, he said that national culture is the development or the growth of national culture takes place in three stages. In the first, the native intellectual is sort of under the native intellectual, meaning the African intellectual himself, is under the influence of the colonizer's culture. And in this stage,
आता जेवण घेऊन गेला, मला घेऊन गेला, भावलं कोण नव्हतं, कोण काही लागे नाही, मग आपणच केलं. काही आता कामातच ते आले तर निर्णय ते उर्दू आले पुढचे होते.
hello, Urmila ma'am.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. I suppose this is an interruption, so we might as well take it as a break. I can hear some background noise. So,
Mayuri Srivan.
Sorry, yeah, please continue. I mean, I'll take care of it. You please continue, sir.
Yeah.
Fine. Thank you for joining me, joining us rather. So we are talking about national culture, and we're talking about Fanon. Yeah. So we're talking about Fanon and how national culture goes through the construction or the development of national culture goes through three stages. And as I said, national culture, in the first stage, the native cultures, the native critic, the native intellectual is under the influence of the colonizer's culture, and he therefore seeks to adopt and assimilate everything by abandoning his own native tradition, his own native literature. So this is the adopt phase. And then the second phase, or the second stage in the formation of a national culture, according to Fanon, is what is called the adapt. The adapt meaning where the native intellectual goes back to his African roots, goes back to his African tradition, starts rediscovering his own native language, his own native traditions and literature. But then the problem, according to Fanon, with this stage is that he also falls into the trap of romanticizing or idealizing his own literature, his own language. Third stage, and which is truly, according to Fanon, the revolutionary.
Karthik, Karthik,
Madam, yeah. Madam, sorry.
can't we mute them from our side?
Madam, yeah, I have asked Madhavi to do it because I have lost power.
Can
I
we
have
do
asked
it from our
Madhavi to
side?
mute them. I have asked Madhavi to mute them because there is no power at my end and she is the co-host.
Okay. Prantik, just excuse me for 2 minutes. I'll just find out.
Because I can't really go on like this.
Yeah. Just give me 2 minutes, sir. We'll do it. Payal Vaidya, please unmute yourself. Sorry, please mute yourself. Payal Vaidya.
Yeah, I think she has muted herself now. Right.
Sorry, sir. Please continue, sir.
Okay. One can't help it. This is the problem of virtual teaching. So anyway, Fanon was therefore, when we talk about Fanon, we are talking about a prophet who became, when I say a prophet, meaning he was the voice of the liberation of Algeria, not just Algeria, but his voice was the voice of Pan-Africa. Any country located in any third world country located either in Africa, Asia, or South America. And so when we talk about Fanon, we are talking about truly a freedom fighter, a liberationary spirit whose early ideas, whose thinking actually completely changed the trajectory of post-colonial studies. With this gentleman that you see on your slide, Edward Said, and with Said, the minute we talk about Said, we are talking about perhaps one whose writings, primarily two books, Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism, are considered to be the foundational texts of the theory of post-colonial studies. I mean, when you think of Orientalism, the one that is prescribed for you for detailed study, now, this is a book that is considered in its influence, in its scope, in its nature, and in its capacity, for generating highly influential ideas. This is a book that one considers to be on par with Darwin's The Origin of Species, or Karl Marx, Das Kapital, or for that matter, Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. I mean, friends, understand the importance, therefore, of this work that you have studied, that your teachers would have done a detailed explanation of the one that is prescribed in your syllabus. So, this is a book, as I said, whose time, it was a book whose time had come. It was written in 1978. Yeah, it was written in 1978, and by the 1960s, you see, perhaps till the beginning of the early decades, that is till the 1920s and the 1930s and 40s, the imperial powers, and by that we mean the European powers, as I said, of France, Germany, and even and of course Great Britain. Nearly three-fourth of the world, the three-fourth of the world was under imperial annexation, of imperial conquest, or colonial rule. But by the 60s, India had already, of course, India had attained its independence in 47. But by the 60s, many of the African states, which were formerly ruled by these imperial powers, had also gained independence after, as I said, after a long, protracted struggle. Said's book, Orientalism, was a book that came at the right time because, it was written in 1978, and in 1978, Said, like Frantz Fanon, who had become the voice of Algeria's independence, struggle for independence from the French Empire, Said, by the 1970s, was already considered as the voice of the struggle for freedom of the Palestinians. And throughout his life, much like Fanon, there's an interesting correspondence, there's an interesting similarity between the political careers and the political thinking of Frantz Fanon and Edward Said. And much like Fanon, Said continued to participate actively in political revolution. He was the voice of Palestinian liberation movement, and of course, he was a man with multiple tastes. He is an excellent. Not many people know that he was other than being a theoretician and a giant intellectual, who in writing Orientalism completely changed, or rather completely defined, the shape of post-colonial studies. He was also an excellent musician. He was a classical. His knowledge of classical music, and he himself was a great music player. Anyway. The point is that Orientalism, therefore, was a book whose time had come, not just because of the context of political liberation, that more and more African and Asian countries were becoming free, but also because by the late 1970s, you have read Derrida, you have read Roland Barthes. You would remember, therefore, that by the 1970s, post-structuralism and postmodernism, including the second wave of feminism, all of these master narratives, all of these major intellectual, social, and cultural movements were already making huge transformations in many societies, and therefore Orientalism was, as I said, was a book whose time had come, because it coincided with 1968. 1978 Orientalism came, but it coincided, barely 10 years back in 1968, you had Derrida talking about structure, sign, and play. And you also had Roland Barthes coming in with, with his radical declaration that the author was dead. So remember that when you're doing literary theory, friends, you need to constantly contextualize the text. You need to constantly locate or situate the thinker that you are doing in terms of the history of ideas, in the history of ideas. So, okay, just a minute. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. It is visible.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the singular contributions that Edward Said made was to uncover the ideology or the politics of power, the manner in which Europe, for example, Europe continued to expand, consolidate, and reinforce its political, military, and economic hegemony over the rest of the world. I mean, and that, for him, for Said, Orientalism, the word Orientalism was not invented, or it was not coined by Said, but Said used it in a very specific way. And that is what the first point on the slide says. Orientalism for Said was a discursive construction. Now, this is, friends, very important. The word discursive construction. Identity is a construct. Understand this. Identity is a construct. Nobody is born with an identity. For example, you as students of MA second year Sem-4, you have an identity Your identity is constructed by the college identity card, or by your university enrollment number, or by your examination form. So, that is an identity that is given to you. It is not self-made. You were not born with an identity which said that you are a student of XYZ college. So identity is always constructed. It is constructed because of a host of extenuating circumstances. The things that around, family, for example, your social background, your educational qualification, the institution where you study, all of these constitute your identity. So one is not born with an identity. It is a construct. But then I just said that your identity is constructed, let us say, by your family, by the community to which you belong, by the religion or the faith that you follow, by the practices, by the rituals and the practices that you abide by, the education institution where you go, the city of your habitation. All of these, together, all of these are what Said, just to simplify Said, would constitute a discourse. So, for example, right now, there is a discourse going on. This is a discourse. What you and I are doing right now is a discourse. A discourse meaning it's a discourse of it's a discourse of teaching learning process that is happening here. But in this discourse, as you can see, there are multiple partners or multiple players, and multiple things are happening all together. You as virtual participants, I as a virtual teacher or a virtual facilitator. Then the identity of the four institutions that are collaborating. Then you are about to appear for a university exam in 4 days, in 3 days' time. All of these together, and not all of them are not all of them are compatible also, not necessarily that they are all compatible, but all of them shape, construct, and develop your identity in a particular way. To put it very simply, when Said says that the Orient or Orientalism, Orient is the subject of Orientalism. So when Said says that Orientalism is the construction of the Orient in a discursive way, what he really means is that the Orient becomes the subject of a network of ideas, belief systems, ideas, beliefs, practices, and knowledge systems, which together construct people of the Orient. That is, people for Said, the Orient meant people of the Middle East, people of the Middle East. But today, when we talk about the Orient, we talk about not just people of the Middle East, but also people of the East, people of the Far East, etc. So Orientalism, therefore, is a huge visible and invisible machinery which constructs the Orient, that is, people from non-Western lands, in specific and particular ways. And what earlier, Fanon had pointed out, that, what is that particular way in which a discourse creates the black native? As I said, it is always in contrast. It is always in opposition to what the white man is. If the white man is modern, civilized, rational, progressive, then the black man, as Fanon demonstrated, then the black man is an identity, is an object, not a subject, but it is an object that is given, an identity that is given to him with a set of attributes which are in opposition to what the white man is. So if the white man is modern, then the black man is primitive. If the white man is civilized, then the black man is a savage. The Orient also, according to Said, is fundamental in defining the West, as he says in Orientalism. He says, as its contrasting image, idea, personality, and experience. It's a binary construction. The Orient is an object. The Orient is an object of study. The history of imperialism is a history of Orientalism. By that I mean is that, as I was telling you earlier, that imperialism, or the conquest and annexation of non-Western lands, peoples, and resources by Western powers has been a phenomena that has taken place from the beginning of from the 16th to the beginning of the 17th century. Well, for nearly 300, 400 years, the West have dominated the East. But according to Said, the West have not only politically, militarily, and economically subjugated the East, but the West has done it in such a fashion, they have fashioned, or rather, let me put it in this way. According to Said, they have also, along with the political and military conquest of the East, they have also produced and constructed an entire body of knowledge whose subject was the Orient. Said calls this phenomena Orientalism. So when European writers, travelers, voyagers, archaeologists, geographers, anthropologists, ethnographers, they were, even biologists and colonial medicine, all of these were systems of knowledge, were bodies of knowledge that were being constructed, that were being developed from the beginning of the 20th century. At the center of it was what Said calls, a binary. That the East helped to define the West as he says, as its contrasting image, as its contrasting idea, as its contrasting personality. He gives, one of the examples. Of course, Orientalism is a book that is full of examples that Said gives, choosing examples choosing examples from a wide-ranging body of writings, from travelers' accounts, from travelers' narratives of the Orient, to literary works such as those of Jane Austen and Kipling. So, for Said, therefore, culture and imperialism go. While we're there, please mute. Yeah. To summarize them, colonialism was not just therefore a military political project, but it was a discursive project. And as I've already explained to you, the Orient was constructed in books written by European scholars, by Western scholars, as primitive, savage, pagan underneath. Orientalism in India, for example, just to make you understand that concept, in Orientalism in India, you see, India was also for more than a century, it was under the rule of the British. And Orientalism as a phenomena, perhaps to understand, Orientalism was also in operation as a cultural phenomena of subjugating native cultures, native languages. You see, we are all called Macaulay's children. I mean, you and I are called Macaulay's children. Why? Because we study, we teach, and we earn our livelihood through English, right? Orientalism was therefore a part of the intellectual it was an intellectual and ideological weapon by which the British, or by which the Western powers justified the conquest of non-Western. How did they do it? As Said explains, by constructing a set of binaries, by making the East as a savage country, by making its people as primitive, or constructing them as primitive people. They justified as if to suggest that it was, as Kipling in a poem says, the white man's burden. This is an example of Orientalism, of Said's version of Orientalism, where, if it's a fairly long poem, but then if you read even the first lines of this poem, where Kipling writes, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your newly caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." Notice According to Said, Orientalism was, as I said, an academic enterprise. And an academic enterprise, it was a system of construction and representation. It also employed a particular vocabulary and a set of images. Notice the vocabulary, notice the language that Kipling employs in this poem, where he talks about what kind of a burden? White man's burden. And what is that white man's burden? The white man's burden is that it stands for the responsibility of the European to go to remote, far off and savage lands in order to bring the fruits of modernity, to bring them education, to bring them progress, to bring them science, to bring them technology, as if to suggest that they were not really conquering lands, that they were not really subjugating people. No, no, no. They were there on a very noble mission, and that was to civilize those people like Indians, Indians like you and me. They were out there to civilize us. And so when I said, Orientalism as a phenomena was seen even in India, where the British, where one of the key administrators, Thomas Macaulay, Babington Macaulay, introduced English language and English instruction as a medium of, the English language as a medium of instruction in schools and colleges. Well, the purpose really was not to benefit us. No, not at all. Macaulay believed that it was only by, he wanted to build, as he said, he wanted to have what he said, a class of babus, a class of clerks who in mind, idea, and opinion would be completely westernized or anglicized, but would function to help the British administration administer the country. So basically, Macaulay's Macaulay's main objective in introducing English education and Western science was not for the benefit of, not for empowering the natives, but merely because he wanted to create a class of bureaucrats, class of clerks or babus, as we call today, in helping, in facilitating the British administration or British rule over India. So that is called the white man's burden. So Said was pointing out in Orientalism, he was pointing out the specific language, the choice, a vocabulary, and a set of images that have been used since the 16th century to the 20th century in constructing the Orient in a particular fashion. And as I said, the Orient as the other of the Occident meaning the West. Right. I feel a lot of sympathy for you people. I don't know how many. I can see only 22 participants here, and I don't really know how many of you are watching live streaming on YouTube. Why? Because when you're in a paper such as this, literary theory, and Unit-4, as I said, Unit-4 actually compresses two huge disciplinary areas, post-colonial theory and culture studies altogether. It's almost impossible what Dr. Karthik, Dr. Urmila Dabir, and Kapil Singhal have done is given me a very daunting task to try and give you try and cover the entire model of Unit-4, in a single 90-minute session. Whoops. It's only so much that you can actually take, but don't get overwhelmed by it, primarily because, as I said before I began talking to you friends, I have assumed that these topics have already been covered. So take a deep breath, because I need to take some oxygen, and let me have some water. While you perhaps take a quick look at White Man's Burden, this particular poem by Rudyard Kipling. Karthik, how are we doing?
Absolutely fine, sir. We are sorry that we are not able to give you much time for that matter. In fact, these topics would require 2 to 3 lectures, at least 2 to 3 lectures. We know that. But we are doing a good job, in fact.
doing like the hero of the movie, the Hollywood movie Speed, or like our own Shankar Mahadevan. I'm doing a breathless act here.
Breathless, yeah.
Right. Friends, I hope I've been able to present to you in as many words as possible, a brief idea of what Orientalism, what Said was doing in Orientalism, what he calls, discourse. The discourse of Orientalism is what as a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient by making statements about it, by authorizing views of it, by describing it, by teaching it, by settling it. Notice that even in this definition, Karthik, please mute. Yeah, thanks. Notice that in this discourse, Orientalism, now you would have understood, is a discourse. It's a specific way, it's a systematic and a particular, it is a systematic and a particular way by which the West constructs the East. And notice also that it's a one-way traffic, that the mode of construction or the power of constructing, of turning the power of constructing, producing and creating knowledge about the Orient does not belong to the Orient themselves, but it belongs to the Western scholars, the Western writers, the Western explorers, the Western travelers. So this is what Said means when he's saying that Orientalism is a corporate institution. It's almost like, an institution. It has structures, it has a machinery, it has an apparatus, it has different apparatuses, and it is backed by, it is called corporate. Said calls it corporate because it is not only backed by modernity's project or the project of modernity, which Western thinkers retrace it to the Enlightenment project, but it is also corporate because it is the driving force, of creating this institution. The whole colonial enterprise. Colonialism was an enterprise that was driven by the greed, not the need, but the greed of Western powers for cheap labor, for cheap resources, and for turning native populations into slaves and bonded labor. So they were here in India, they were here in Africa because they wanted to exploit these third world underdeveloped countries to the fullest. And therefore, it is a corporate institution. Said calls it a corporate institution because it is driven by corporate greed. It is driven by capitalism. It is driven by market forces. Crisis. I mean, I'm sure you would have read the essay. But what, therefore, is the crisis? If Orientalism as a discourse, and as Said, argues, has been an imperial ideological weapon, and a weapon that has sort of solidified and reinforced Orientalism as a political and as a economic force of exploitation for so many years, for hundreds of years, then what is the crisis that he talks about in this chapter? Orientalism, the book itself, is divided into three parts. And the first part is the scope of Orientalism. It has three broad sections. And it is the essay that is prescribed is actually an excerpt. It is a part of the first chapter called the scope of Orientalism. Now, after he has given everything that I've just tried to summarize for you, how the East constructed the West, how the West constructed the East. How is this construction a discourse? How were knowledges, not singular knowledge, but how knowledges were constructed in order to justify and legitimize the project, the exploitative imperial project as the white man's burden, as a civilizing machine, as a civilizing and noble mission. All of it Said talks about in the first chapter. he also gives you contemporary examples. Examples of what? Examples of the way in which imperialism, or Orientalism continues to, perpetuate its exploitative practices in new disguises, in new forms. What in my early definition, in my earlier slide, I had drawn your attention to the word neo-colonialism. So Orientalism also exists in many forms, in many disguises. So what is the crisis, therefore, that Said refers to in Orientalism? What he talks about? The crisis really is one of the major conferences was in Asian history is a conference that was called the Bandung Conference. In world history or world politics, it's called the Bandung Conference. And it was essentially, for the first time, it was a conference which invited the state leaders of countries that had recently acquired independence. The shape of world politics had changed. By the 1960s and 70s, the shape of world politics had changed. There was a shift even in the exertion of European power, with the United States of America becoming the superpower that Great Britain was for nearly, right from the 17th, 18th to perhaps to the middle of the 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century. So there was a perceptible and radical shift in the very nature in which world politics was being. But to cut a long story short, the crisis emerged precisely because that if Orientalism as a disciplinary, systematic body of knowledge that was constructed by European or Western scholars and Western thinkers about the Orient, then what happens to this? What is the status? What is the future of Orientalism? What is its present status? By present status, well, Said was meaning the 1970s. What was its what does Orientalism continue to flourish? Does it continue to prosper? Do people still continue to write about native populations that were native populations now, or rather of colonized people who had now become free and independent? Is there a possibility of a counter discourse? Was there? What Said was saying, or rather asking, was that now that former colonized people were now free, they were independent. Was it a possibility now? Were they writing? Were they able to write about themselves in a manner that would challenge Orientalism as an exploitative and a privileged discourse of the West? So what was the crisis? The crisis was precisely this, that by the time the Bandung Conference was held, most of the countries in Africa and Asia had already become independent. They had freed themselves from colonial rule and colonial exploitation. And so the crisis really was that what happens then to the Oriental scholars? What happened to those experts, and their work? How do they now write and construct the Orient? Because clearly the nature of Orient has changed. In what was the nature and identity of the Orient in colonized countries is no longer the same as an independent or a post-colonial country. So the question of post-coloniality, which I again explained to you in my key terms in the opening slide, that question is the one that brought about the crisis in Orientalism, because clearly this body of scholarly work, or the production of knowledge, could not be continued in the same vein, in the same manner by these scholars. Remember, when we talk about Oriental scholarship, this is an Oriental scholarship of nearly 100 years, where classical scholars such as William Jones, for example, or the travel writing of Burton, all of these writers, where they were representing, they were describing, narrating, and representing what they perceived or what they imagined the Orient to be. And Said's argument was that their construction, the Western construction of the Orient,
is an imaginary and an illusory construction. The Orient in Orientalism, by Orientalism, I mean the scholarship, the body of work, was not the Orient in reality. Said gives specific examples in this excerpt, Crisis in Orientalism itself. You know, he talks about Napoleon's conquest. Talks about Napoleon's conquest of Egypt, for example, and he cites this example as an illustration of Orientalism. You know, when Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to invade Egypt, well, he didn't send his soldiers or his army. What he did first was to send a team of scholars and experts who he wanted first to study the Egyptian literatures, the Egyptian languages, the Egyptian cultural habits and belief systems, and then come back to him with this body of knowledge, so that his army, his political machinery, his political administrators, when they would go and would follow in order to annex Egypt, using this knowledge for their benefit. So knowledge is used as a form of power. Knowledge is power. And Orientalism is, because it is the construction of knowledge, it is the operation of power, because it is driven by the ideology of imperialism. It is driven by the belief that Western powers have a sort of a legitimate right in order to rule over non-Western countries. Why? Because they need to provide enlightenment. So the two examples that he gives in Crisis in Orientalism, there are many examples, of course, but you know, the Napoleon conquest, the conquest of Egypt by Napoleon, where, as I said, he first sent scholars to study native habits, native cultures, native languages, and then, armed with this knowledge, he sent his troops, he sent his army to invade and rule over Egypt. The other gentleman, the other example is that of this gentleman, Ferdinand de Lesseps. What time is it? And he's the man who is given the credit for doing the Suez Canal, the credit for constructing, envisioning the Suez Canal. And without, again, it'll take a lot of time if I go, but this is a specific example again of how Orientalism works, because Ferdinand de Lesseps was an architect, he was an engineer, and he was a civil constructor. But the Suez Canal, once again, was something that he envisioned not just to open an easy route of navigation, but to make it possible for European powers, to make it possible for the French, to make it possible for the French to continue with their occupation of places in Northeast Africa. Friends, I don't know whether you have either heard of or seen, this is a very famous personality, or rather an iconic figure that Lawrence of Arabia. The film is Lawrence of Arabia. The slides on your left, the left of your screen, is from the film Lawrence of Arabia, and the gentleman in his military suit, in fact, is Lance Corporal T.E. Lawrence, right? Who was actually an archaeologist, but also who served the British Army in its occupation of Egypt. And he played a stellar role. In the 1920s, there was a war. It's called the Great Arab War, or the Great Arab Rebellion. This was a war in which he sided with the Arabs in their attempt to dislodge the Ottoman rulers, the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. And he played such a huge role that not only did he lead the rebellious Arab contingent, the Arab army, in dethroning the Emir. But he also sort of appropriated Arab culture, Arab language, and what you can see the contrast between T.E. Lawrence, the British soldier, and the same British soldier on your left, wearing the garb of an Arab. Such was what he became a celebrity. He became a celebrity, and he perhaps becomes one of the most symptomatic figures, an emblematic figure of Orientalism, is precisely because he was not just an imperial administrator, not only somebody who sided with the Arabs, as I said, in their war against the Ottoman rulers, but he also wrote. And one of his writings, one of his famous books, is this book called The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which sort of is a first person autobiographical account of Lawrence's own experiences of what Said would call the Arab experience. But what you see again is that in his writings, what comes through is a set of racial prejudices and a set of the habit of writing about or describing Arabs in a stereotypical way. Arabs as being untrustworthy, Arabs as being lazy. Although, as I said, he himself sided with the Arabs. He himself led the Arabs in their war of independence. But Seven Pillars of Wisdom is a wonderful example of what Said calls Orientalism as a literature, Orientalism in literature. And then, 30, 40 years later, based on the life and times of this cult, this iconic hero, which the British Army and the British people celebrated, Lawrence, came the film Lawrence of Arabia, directed by this very famous British director, David Lean. So both the film as well as Lawrence's own book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, are good examples to illustrate to you the continuing legacy of Orientalism. When I said that Orientalism continues to influence and impact the minds of people, to shape the way in which people of the East and the Near East are looked upon by the Western world, Hollywood films, for example, and best-selling books such as Seven Pillars of Wisdom go a long way in continuing to perpetuate, these myths that are mistaken as reality, or rather not mistaken, myths that are represented, that are constructed and represented as facts. Homi Bhabha. We come to the final post-colonial critic. What I've done for you, is to quickly capture in detail the essay, Crisis, or rather the excerpt, Crisis in Orientalism, and therefore I thought I'll spend a little more time in doing Orientalism with you, because that is prescribed for detailed study, right? In your background topic, again, we have Homi Bhabha, and they're of the Trimurti or the Trinity, call it whichever. Said, Bhabha, and Spivak are called, as the Holy Trinity of post-colonial theory. So Bhabha talks about, once again, is an extremely influential thinker in the area studies of post-colonialism. And just give me a minute. So when you think of Bhabha, from your exam point of view, of course, I'm sorry, I'm not very exam oriented, but I think you need to remember two seminal books that again have had a huge impact in mapping the trajectory of post-colonial theory: The Location of Culture, that you see the bottom bullet point, The Location of Culture, and Nation and Narrative. The location of culture is very important because it is in this work that he talks about, once again, he talks about the construction of the native as a subject. Bhabha is, somebody who brings post-structuralism, the methodology or the thinking of post-structuralism, along with Lacanian psychoanalysis. And what he proposes is that in a colonial colonizer, in the colonizer-colonized encounter, identities are constructed, identities are formed, much like what Said said, that the West constructed the East not only in opposition but also to self-define themselves. So in a similar way, Bhabha carries the same thought, but using the lens of psychoanalysis, particularly Lacanian psychoanalytical theory, in order to suggest that that in a colonial discourse, the colonizer-colonized encounter is a discourse, and he says that it is a very ambivalent. It is a very ambivalent discourse. When you think of Bhabha, remember three key terms, or rather four terms. One is ambivalence, second is mimicry, third is hybridity, and fourth is third space. So ambivalence, mimicry, hybridity, and third space. And all four of them are not independent categories or independent ideas, they all are interrelated. So in a colonial discourse, for example, or a colonial encounter, the colonizer feels both attracted to the native as well as repelled by the native. So what he calls fetish and phobia. He uses two psychoanalytical terms, borrowing from Lacan. He uses two psychoanalytical terms called fetish and phobia. Fetish is, something that an obsession with something. So for the colonizer, that is the white man, the native is a fetish. He wants to know he's attracted, he wants to know the native. So he comes closer to the native. But at the same time, there is also a phobia. A phobia is not just fear, it's an irrational fear, it's an irrational dread. But at the same time, the white man also, even as he is attracted to the native, maybe a black man or a brown man, but he also is repelled. He's repelled by the native. And so there is a dread. There is a dread that his own identity may be subsumed, by the native. So it is this constant, the position of the colonizer in a discourse, in an encounter, seems to be always ridden by ambivalence. But ambivalence is something that is also shown by the native subject. You see, one would think that because the European power is so mighty, so powerful and so mighty, that the native does not have any freedom, that the native does not have any agency. Just a minute. So the colonial encounter is essentially an encounter where two identities meet, the colonizer's identity and the native identity, and they contest and resist each other. And in an essay called Of Mimicry and Man, it is in this essay that Bhabha shows, how the colonial authority, the flow of power is not unidirectional. It doesn't mean it in the colonial encounter, Bhabha argues, or Bhabha illustrates, that the native is not without any agency, that the native can actually undermine the authority or the domination of the colonizer by using certain strategies. What is that strategy? Well, he says mimic. The native mimics. Just as Fanon had argued in Black Skin and White Mask that the only alternative for the black man to have a sense of self-identity and self-respect in his life is to become more white-like. So therefore, he titled he chose to give the title of his work as Black Skin and in White Mask. In a similar way, you see the continuation of that thought. Bhabha argues that the mimic man is who? The native. It is the native who seeks to be like the white man by mimicking him. But unlike Fanon, Bhabha argues that the native man mimics the white man from a position of strength, not altogether of subjugation, but also from a position of strength. Because the more the black man becomes white, the more he threatens the white man. The more English we become, the more the Englishman becomes threatened. The more you do your MA with flying colors and get a PhD, the more the English scholar sitting in Oxford and Cambridge gets threatened. That for him, I mean, I'm giving it again, putting it as a very simple example, but just to bring home to you the idea of mimicry, that in a colonial encounter, therefore, the position of both the colonizer and the colonized is a very ambivalent one, and it is not just one of superiority and inferiority, as Fanon had said. And the mimic man, the native who is a mimic man, by the way, the mimic man also, as you see on your slide, is the name of a very seminal book novel called The Mimic Men by V.S. Naipaul, where the central character, now I don't remember, the central character's name is, he has an English first name and he's Singh. I don't remember. But anyway, he's a hybrid man. He's the hybrid man. He is Bhabha's hybrid man because he's an Indian born in the Caribbean, but having a bureaucratic career in Britain. And so what Naipaul does in The Mimic Men is to narrate the problems and the problems and tensions of identity that his protagonist faces in trying to negotiate these three different identities. As I said, an identity of being born in India, an identity of being in the Caribbean for a short while, and then joining the imperial or the British bureaucratic service in London. So he is the hybrid man. And third space for Bhabha, the colonial encounter is the site of the third space, because here he also calls it the liminal space, a space where nothing is fixed, nothing is permanent, nothing is absolute, a space which is relational, a space which is differential, and a space which is fluid. So the third space, according to Bhabha, is where the hybrid man or the mimic man can resist, can contest, and can oppose the domination of the white man. And finally, you would have guessed, Karthik, that I'm only covering now the post-colonial part. It's impossible to squeeze in now another on culture studies. So when we talk about subaltern, here we are talking about the third member of the Trinity. Again, a very iconic figure, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. But to understand her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, which is not prescribed in your course, but the word subaltern is mentioned as a background topic. So I'll just make a final few comments on what is a subaltern. A subaltern, it was earlier used in military service as somebody who is of an inferior rank, subaltern of an inferior rank. And it was however turned into a theoretical term by somebody, a Marxist philosopher named Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, in his writings collectively called as prison notebooks, he was put behind bars by the then fascist government in the 1920s, redefined the word subaltern. He used the word subaltern to he expanded the meaning of the word subaltern to include all marginalized and oppressed people. And Spivak is an Indian post-colonial critic who is, of course, who's located in Harvard. She and Bhabha, in fact, are both are scholars, post-colonial thinkers who are located in these famous universities. And what she does is, in an essay called "Can the Subaltern Speak," which came out in 1985, she talks about she addresses the problem with the subaltern in particular connection, with particular relation to Indian women. How are Indian women? How are Indian women constructed as a subject of what discourse? Not Orientalism, but of colonialism itself. Spivak goes back to the 19th century and examines how Indian women, the practice of sati and child marriages and widow remarriages, and she talks about how how the British administration dominated Bengal in the name of eradicating the social evils and representing. They claimed that they were the protectors and custodians of these women, unfortunate women who on the death of their husbands were put to the fire. But what Spivak does is to argue is that in this entire discourse meaning a discourse which has many narratives. So there is a narrative of the British administration and the British officers who said that we are here as rescuers, knights in shining armor, knights in shining armor who want to protect these unfortunate widows. But there is also a discourse of, for example, people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, or the members of the Brahmo Samaj movement, which was at its peak in the mid 19th century, who wanted to protect native traditions. So there was this narrative as well of the Bengali intellectuals and and members and intellectuals and statesmen like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who spoke out for the women. Now, what Spivak says that in these many narratives, the narrative of the British, the narrative of the Brahmo Samaj, the narrative of freedom fighters, what was missing was the voice of the woman herself. That the widow, those women for whom all these contesting narratives were being created, did not have any representation, did not have the power or the agency to represent themselves. And Spivak goes on to argue or demonstrate in this essay that unfortunately in third world countries such as India, the woman becomes a subaltern twice over. She's doubly colonized. She is victimized and exploited by colonialism, but she is equally victimized and exploited by patriarchy, by a feudal patriarchy. So she is doubly victimized. And this is where she takes up the issue that can the Indian woman, for example, speak for herself? And her argument, many people think that they cannot. What many people believe that Spivak was saying, that the answer to the question, can the subaltern speak, is a no, is an emphatic no. No. In fact, Spivak went on to write many other writings, many other essays, in which she sort of explained what she meant by what could be the response or what could be the answer to the question, can the subaltern speak? And she says that her question should not be taken literally, whether the Indian, the hapless Indian woman can speak or not. More importantly, within a discourse of colonialism and patriarchy, can the woman speak and be listened to? Can she represent herself? So of course she talks about the difficulty, to argue that the difficulty of representing, that it is an impossible task, that the voice of it's impossible to retrieve the voice of the subaltern. Spivak argues that it is impossible to retrieve the voice of the subaltern by intellectuals who, even with well-intentioned objectives, may want to speak for her. Because this discourse is never, according to Spivak, a transparent discourse. So she concludes this essay, the subaltern essay, by suggesting that, by arguing that all notions and representations of subaltern consciousness or third world women is a construction again of Western discourses. So it is these discourses that construct the subaltern and give it a voice. And the final key word, key term that students you should know, you should study for your exams. A term that again is associated with the word subaltern is subaltern studies. This group of primarily Indian historians, or you could call subcontinental historians, who in the 40s and the 50s, or rather 50s and 60s, came together to rewrite and reconstruct the mainstream history of the Indian freedom movement. So when you go back, whatever when we read about the history of the freedom struggle of India, we go back to our history text that we studied in school. And we all know, we all know the way in which it is projected. It is narrativized. This particular history is narrativized by key freedom struggle leaders like a Gandhi, a Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, a Netaji, Jawaharlal Nehru, etc., etc. But the purpose of people like Ranajit Guho or the other historians like Shahid Amin, who passed away last year, and Gyanendra Pandey, David Arnold, Dipesh Chakraborty, Partha Chatterjee, these are the major practitioners, historians, Indian historians who belong to this project called Subaltern History. They argue, or rather they uncover not history with a capital H, which is mainstream history, but many histories with in a small case, which means histories from below. So they, for example, it is they who have projected, they have foregrounded the many mini revolutions, the many revolts of tribal leaders, of peasants and farmers and women and nomadic tribes, all of them who at some point in time have unfurled the banner of rebellion against the British. So the subaltern historians, therefore, is a project. It is an intellectual project. It is driven primarily with the theories of Marxism, for example. It is a left-leaning enterprise, but nevertheless, what it does is that these writers, by exploring and highlighting the many micro narratives or the micro histories of tribal movement, tribal protest movements, peasants and farmers, and the rebellion of women, what they have done is to suggest that the history of a nation is not just one story. It has many other stories. So what it does is, therefore, that these bunch of historians have radically rewritten the history of the freedom movement. Primarily, the focus has been the freedom struggle against the British, and given us many, many other narratives. And in rewriting it, they have sort of fulfilled what Said has always argued for, or rather what Said has envisioned. The purpose of Said has written, as I said, many, many writings, and all of them envisage, both Fanon and Said envisage a future based on a future where the minorities marginalized and the oppressed classes would find a voice and rewrite what they believe are the grand narratives or the meta narratives by speaking for themselves, by representing themselves and truly making the subaltern mainstream. So thank you so much. I think this is the an exhaustion of theory. And if I were to prolong it and move into culture studies, it would probably, you will, both I and my dear students will have to be carried away on stretchers. And there is only so much ideas and theory that you can take in one session. It's 2 hours. So thank you, Karthik.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. In fact, I must salute the effort, that you have put in to cover all these topics. We know it would always have been a very challenging task to cover all these varied topics in one lecture. But then I suppose you did a great job. At least gave them an overall idea of the different concepts, and you took your own time for that matter. And I suppose it would help the students. As you said earlier, the exams are just around the corner. So this would help. At least for the MCQ part, and the concepts would be very clear to them, I suppose, by now. So I mean, on behalf of all the uh, uh, all the 4 colleges and our students, let me thank you for sparing your time. I know you have a very difficult time at home, and you spared very valuable time for our students. You spared almost 2 hours for our students. Thank you so much, sir. I don't know how to thank you more than this. It has been a, I was all through the lecture I was there. In fact, it helped me also to a great extent. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you once again. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I suppose,
Thank you,
can I
sir.
leave? Can
Good
I
day, sir.
leave? Yeah.
Yeah, sure, sir.